Hi, welcome to another episode of U.S. History with Lennox. In the 1950s, there was an anti-colonial movement in Vietnam between the Vietnamese led by Ho Chi Minh and the French. This guerrilla war is going to result in the Vietnamese gaining their independence from France. However, at the Geneva Peace Conference, there's a decision to split Vietnam between the northern side, which will be a communist-based government, and the southern side, which will be an independent, non-communist country. In 1960, the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, are going to challenge that South Vietnamese government, and a civil war is going to erupt in South Vietnam. Now, the United States is still focused on its containment policy in the world. And John F. Kennedy, president at the time, believed in the domino theory that if Vietnam fell into communism, it's just a matter of time before all the surrounding countries will fall. So he is going to send in American troops for the very first time, and they will be going in as advisors to the South Vietnamese army. Now, over a 2-year period, nearly 16,000 troops will go in as advisors. After Kennedy is assassinated, Lyndon Johnson becomes the president. And in August of 1964, he announced that 2 American destroyers had been attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. This is going to lead Congress to passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and the United States' direct involvement in fighting in Vietnam. Now, initially, Americans were fully behind this war. They supported the United States preventing the spread of communism. But what's going to happen in 1 year will completely change American viewpoints. The year is 1968. So what was it about 1968 that is going to turn the tide in Vietnam, both over there and here at home as well? Well, it's going to be a series of events, and it's just like one thing happening after another. And all together, it literally changes not only how we feel about American involvement in Vietnam, but how we feel about our government as well. So let's take a look at 1968. It's going to start in January with the Tet Offensive. This is considered a turning point in the Vietnam War. U.S. involvement had escalated in Vietnam, and in January we were at the height of our troop involvement. Following this offensive, though, Johnson is going to change his stance. February, Walter Cronkite, probably the most trusted voice in the American press, came out and said to the American people, "It seems that the Vietnam War will end in a stalemate." Man, that's what happened in Korea. We don't want to see that happen here as well. I mean, we've been fighting there since 1963 for 5 years, and now Cronkite is telling us it's going to be a stalemate. That's not acceptable. March of 1968, Lyndon Johnson is going to decide not to run for a second term. He's going to take a step back. He wants to spend the remainder of his term focused on getting us out of Vietnam, negotiating peace. April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. This is going to send a shockwave through our country for everyone. If that wasn't enough, in June of 1968, Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, who is now running for the Democratic nomination for president, is also assassinated. Within 2 months of one another, we lost 2 influential leaders of America. In August of 1968, the tension throughout America is starting to boil over, and the Democratic National Convention in Chicago is going to result in riots. It's going to start when Hubert Humphrey, the presumptive Democratic nominee and strong supporter of Lyndon Johnson, is nominated. Lyndon Johnson and his policies in Vietnam are under severe scrutiny at this point. And so you have a lot of anti-war demonstrators showing up against Humphreys at the Democratic National Convention. Richard Daley, the mayor of Chicago, is going to call out more and more police presence around the convention hall. The tension is going to rise, and you're going to see fighting between the protesters and the police, resulting in these riots. And then finally, in November of 1968, Richard Nixon is elected president. He runs on the idea of ending the war in Vietnam. He, along with an independent candidate, George Wallace, are going to garner 57% of the vote, showing that America wanted change. They were tired of the war, they were tired of the protests and everything else that had been going on, and they were seeking change for America. So let's talk a little bit more about some of these events, a little bit more in depth. Let's start first with Tet. I said that this was the turning point of the war in Vietnam. Basically what happened is Tet is the Vietnamese New Year. And in 1968, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese are going to launch a surprise attack throughout South Vietnam, which is going to be heavily covered by our press. While the Viet Cong suffered a lot of losses, it actually was a political victory for them because it showed that their presence was strong throughout Vietnam, both North and South. And it actually showed the American people through the press that we were nowhere close to winning this war. Something that has not been shared with us at all. In fact, what we realized was there was a credibility gap between the government and the people. And opposition started to grow against this war. Americans had lost their faith in the government because they hadn't been telling us the truth. That was what was so important about that report from Walter Cronkite. He is the first to tell the Americans, I don't know that we can win this war. And so this credibility gap is going to start to grow. And honestly, it's never really been closed. There still is a lot of distrust of the government in existence today. In March of this same year, the My Lai massacre is going to become public knowledge to the American people. In this event, an American platoon massacred more than 200 South Vietnamese civilians because they thought they were part of the Viet Cong. It happened in a Vietnamese village called My Lai. When the press got there, it was very clear that the majority of the victims were women and children. And what this is going to do is this is going to add to this belief that is growing in America that this war is brutal and it's senseless and it can't be won. 1968, like I mentioned, Johnson decided not to run for re-election. Bobby Kennedy becomes the #1 leading candidate for the Democratic Party. But when he's assassinated, that's going to elevate the vice president at the time, Hubert Humphrey, to the candidacy for the Democrats. As I said, Humphrey carried with him most of Johnson's policies, and America was tired of him. America didn't trust Johnson. They didn't trust the government at all. And so Humphrey just seemed to be a representation of what they already had. The Republicans are going to nominate Richard Nixon. Now remember, he had lost to JFK in 1960, but he is going to run again, obviously. When we look at the election of 1968, we had 3 primary candidates. You had Humphrey for the Democrats, Nixon for the Republicans, and George Wallace as an independent. There was fear that we might have to get to a House of Representatives runoff between Nixon and Wallace. However, when it came time to count the vote, though the popular vote was close, Nixon had won it, and he also had a huge electoral college victory. Before he can take office, the draft lottery is going to start. There were a lot of Americans who believed that our draft system was unfair, and that minorities were making up a large percentage of the soldiers in Vietnam. And as the war continued, more and more men were drafted. Remember, Johnson, in the early years of the war, was escalating the number of troops over in Vietnam. At one point, I believe we reached 2 million soldiers who were stationed there. The way the draft lottery would work would be based on numbers. They would announce a series of numbers that were going to be drafted, for instance, 25 to 50. And then using this sequence chart, you would use your date of birth and see if your number fell within that range. So if your birthday was on July 13th, you would go to this chart, look up your date of birth, and you would see that your draft number is 42. You've just been drafted. Protests are going to continue in the United States, and a lot of them are taking place on college campuses. One of the most infamous is the Kent State Massacre. April of 1970, Nixon announced that the American troops had invaded Cambodia. Now, this should jump out at you as something wrong because we weren't fighting against Cambodia. We were fighting against Vietnam. And that's what the War Powers Act of 1964 had stated, that the president had the authority to wage war in Vietnam. Well, when Nixon invades Cambodia, trying to block off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Americans see the possible expansion of this war, and they're not having it. Because of this, anti-war advocates see this escalation of war, and this is going to spark a lot of violent protests on college campuses throughout the country. An example of this is at Kent State in Ohio. This protest broke out and the National Guard was called in to control the protesters. The protesters started to push back against the National Guard and someone fired a shot into the student protesters. In the end, 4 students will be killed as a result of this. But like I said, it wasn't just at Kent State. It was at college campuses throughout the country. It was also in Washington, D.C. and other cities throughout the country. In 1971, because of the anger with the draft, there were a lot of people questioning the age that these men were being drafted. The average age of an American soldier at the time was 19 years old. At this point, you had to be 21 to vote. And the argument was made, if you're old enough to fight, shouldn't you be old enough to vote? I mean, you should have a voice in these congressmen who are making decisions to send you off to war. So in 1971, the 26th Amendment will be ratified, which will lower the voting age to 18. Now, Nixon had promised the withdrawal of troops from Vietnam when he took office. The name of his plan was Vietnamization. And the idea behind this is that American troops would start training the South Vietnamese to be able to fight on their own, and we would be able to slowly start pulling our troops and bringing them home. Even though he was cutting back the number of troops in Vietnam, we were so divided here that war protests continued and grew. What will eventually happen to bring Vietnam to an end is the negotiation of a ceasefire agreement. By 1975, the United States had withdrawn all of its people from Vietnam. Later in that year, North Vietnam is going to violate the ceasefire and they will capture the capital city of Saigon. The war was over. The communists had won. Containment had failed. Everything that happened from 1963 on is going to be examined by government officials and others. In 1973, the War Powers Act is going to be passed. What this did was it required the president to inform Congress of any commitment of troops they ever sent out within 48 hours. Why did they do this? Well, let's go back to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Johnson a blank check to wage war in Vietnam. It was unconstitutional. Guys, the U.S. Constitution says only Congress has the power to declare war. In passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, Congress allowed our president to wage a war without ever declaring it. The Vietnam War is seen as an illegal war because Congress never declared war. And then also in 1971, a former Defense Department worker leaked some papers to the New York Times. They became known as the Pentagon Papers. And basically, they told us, I think, what we already knew, that the government had not been honest with the American people, and that various administrations, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, had deceived Congress, the media, and the public about what was going on in the war. That was that credibility gap. But now we have documents to prove it. The gap grows larger. That brings us to the end of the Vietnam War. The effects are still being felt today. With the War Powers Act, presidents now have to have congressional approval really any time they execute any type of military action. They have 48 hours to let Congress know what they're doing and why. And Congress has the authority to undo what any president has done in those cases. Americans, like I said, today still don't trust the government. And it all can be tied back to the 1960s, specifically 1968. So there you have it, the Vietnam War, and how it literally changed the course of America going forward. Hopefully you learned a little bit more about the war that you might not have known before. If so, go ahead and give me a like. If you feel the need, you can subscribe. I won't say no. But I thank you for watching. Can't wait to see you on the next one. Bye-bye.